I'm reading, I'm coming to the end of Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. It's a book written by Stuart Holroyd and published in 1977. It's about a happening, an incident in 1975, and the incident is described in the previous chapter, chapter 8. This plays in the Middle East, and the three of them prevented an outbreak of World War because the Lake of Galilee was meant to be poisoned by some radicals, and they prevented it by their meditation and by the management, which is the extraterrestrials, which Phyllis is channeling. On their guidance, they did the meditation, and it did basically not happen. So Stuart Holroyd is going through various questions in chapter 9, and anatomy anatomy of a mystery. This is the second reading, and he has headings. Here is the third heading: Other Mental Functions and Attributes. As I have listened to the recordings of the communications in sequence over the past months, I have been struck by three particular characteristics. Tom's faculty for total and accurate recall, Tom is the speaker for the extraterrestrials, the group. Tom's faculty for total and accurate recall of the content of earlier communications, the factual and conceptual consistency of the communications as a whole, and a curious decline in the language of the communications with the passage of time. These 3 points may be illustrated with one example. The reader will recall that the very first time Tom appeared was when Phyllis fell into an involuntary trance at Count Pino Turola's house in Miami, and uttered a chant in an ancient language. Tom explained that the language came from some 34,000 years ago, when there were 3 cultures, 3 divisions from 3 areas of the universe. One came with love, one came to own, and one came to observe. The one that observed recorded it, that the one that possessed controlled the minds. The being that came tried to prevent. There was a massacre. A much more advanced civilization began then, was lost. That was in March 1974. 6 months later, in October 1974, Andrija referred back to this communication, and without prompting, Tom said, "We spoke at that time of a massacre." Another year passed, and in October 1975, John again referred to the first communication and asked how it related to what they had learned since. Tom answered, "If you will review of those of your communications, it is of a similar. There were of those that began of that of the earth, and that of the seeding, and that of the doctor came in, that of the time. And there were of those of the negative forces that came to attempt to control. If you recall, we have told you of that too. And there were those, such as that of Altea, and of other higher civilizations, that had the observation and remembrance of this. And there was you, and of our doctor, that in truth observed, and that of us." Then John asked about the massacre and received the reply, "It was a diminishing of spiritual self." This communication is of much later vintage than others in this book, and the decline in the language will be apparent to every reader. Asked to explain this, Tom has said that it is due to a gradual exhaustion of the channeling faculties of the being, Phyllis, and in view of our ignorance of the mechanism referred to, we either have to accept this or put it down to a refinement of cunning on Phyllis' part. If it were the latter, it would be a rather supererogatory refinement, and one that would be tedious to sustain. Supererogatory. The chief interest of the above-quoted passage, however, is that it elaborates a communication that antedates it by 18 months, with information received in the interim. Reference to the seeding, the previous incarnations of Andrija and John, the civilization of Altea, and the attempt of the negative forces to exercise control, both elucidate the original message and are elucidated by it. This is but one example. Statements like, if you review your tapes and if you recall, occur constantly in the communications, and subsequent checking has always confirmed that the point referred to has indeed been previously communicated. Tom's faculty of total and instantaneous recall is certainly impressive. Even more impressive is the consistency of the factual and conceptual content of the communications. There's nothing ad hoc about the information, no sense of its having been built up as the communications have proceeded. It carries the stamp of something revealed rather than created, of something that existed in tota before the first communication was received, in toto. Tom's initial elliptical reference to the three cultures, of which one came with love, one came to own, and one came to observe, encapsulated a mass of detailed information that was to be elaborated in later communications. It is information, one feels, that was already there, and to say already there implies the existence of an independent mind, unless we wish to invoke the ancient esoteric belief in the Akashic records, which is a point I shall return later. If either of the hypotheses I have categorized as transcendental were correct, we would expect Tom to exhibit ESP abilities. The term, of course, means extrasensory perception, and as neither a discarnate entity nor an extraterrestrial would have a sensory system like that of a human being, he would not be subject to the limitations of human sensory systems. Tom does, in fact, convincingly exhibit faculties of telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Often in the communications he says, "Yes, Sir John," or "Yes, Doctor." Invariably, John or Andrija responds immediately with a question, or by making a point that clearly was on his mind, and he was waiting to put. They became accustomed to this, and it soon ceased to surprise them, and the listener to the tapes, too, tends to become blasé about small marvels, when the frontiers of his credulity are under barrage from much bigger guns. But the evidence for Tom's infallibly right anticipatory telepathy and mind reading is convincing, and has to be taken into account in any attempt to determine who or what Tom is. Evidence for precognition is also convincing. particularly with regard to developments in the Middle East political situation, as I pointed out in the final chapter of the narrative. As regards clairvoyance, Tom has often allegedly exercised this faculty in order to report to his colleagues on the deliberations taking place in the higher political echelons in the US, Russia, Israel, and the Arab countries. But of course, the truth of these reports is difficult to verify, though occasionally one can pick up an intriguing hint of a correspondence. For example, within days of the completion of their last mission in Israel, the Jerusalem Post reported the visit of a top Russian missile expert to Syria. Also, the allegations that the US was considering military actions in Saudi Arabia seemed too fantastic when Tom made it in November. But in January, Dr. Kissinger made a faux pas by stating publicly that the use of force against the oil-producing countries would be dangerous, but could not be ruled out. And during his Middle East trip in March, he had to make a special visit to the Saudi Arabian capital to explain himself to King Faisal. To conclude this section then, the evidence for the exercise of supernormal, by human standards, memory functions and of what we would call ESP faculties, together with the inherent consistency of the communication, supports the same conclusion as was arrived at in the two previous subsections of this discussion, that Tom is an independent intelligence of some kind. In other words, it weighs in favor of our original hypotheses 4 and 5. Let us now approach the question of Tom's identity from another angle and consider, heading, the content of the communications. In recent years, a great deal has been published on the subject of UFOs, prehistoric civilizations on Earth, the visits and influence of extraterrestrials, Atlantis, reincarnation, the intelligence of dolphins, the New Age, and the traditions of the apocalypse. These are also the predominant themes of the communications. Depending on your point of view, you might argue that this correspondence indicates that objective truth is now being revealed to different individuals and groups on Earth, or that it is a case of the exponential growth of congeries of baseless beliefs, powered by man's incorrigible need for novelties and wonders. William James observed that the zeitgeist has always much to do with shaping trance phenomena, and he raised the question whether all subconscious selves are peculiarly susceptible to a certain stratum of the zeitgeist and get their information from it. This is a question we should certainly bear in mind when considering the significance of the fact that the content of the communications corresponds with that of a great deal of contemporary popular esotericism. But to speak of getting information from a stratum of the zeitgeist is rather vague. It's not a description of how the information is obtained, but an observation that it corresponds with the information from other sources. It is an insight worth pursuing, though, so let us consider the possibilities as to how and whence the information content of the communications is obtained. Again, I suggest 5 possibilities for consideration. 1, that the information is stored in Phyllis' unconscious memory and becomes accessible only when she's in trance. 2, that in trance, Phyllis establishes a rapport with the unconscious minds of the sitters and draws the information therefrom. 3, that she draws the information from the consciousness of a distant person or persons, or by clairvoyance from books, etc. 4, that she has access to the cosmic reservoir of information and memories that esoterists call the Akashic records. 5, that she is indeed channeling information that emanates from a non-human intelligence. I will make a few remarks on each of these possibilities. With regard to the first and the critical literature of psychical research, the possession of unlikely knowledge is often put down to cryptomnesia, or unconscious memory. If the person has at any time had access to the information in question, even by glancing through a book many years before, it is theoretically possible that a photographic memory function of the unconscious may be triggered into action when the person is in an altered state of consciousness, such as trance. However, Phyllis is not a bookish person, nor widely read, and considering the wide range of subject matter covered by the communications, and also the fact that there is internal consistency between information in different categories, for instance cosmology and the interpretation of revelation, cryptomnesia seems a highly improbable explanation. It is also incidentally one that Tom is well aware of. In one communication he said, "If one of your channels were a student of the book, the Bible, and then in her channeling or in her dream state or her inspirational state she received information as in the book, would you know if it were true or in her mind? It is better for the channel not to have previous knowledge." The possibility that Phyllis relays back information which she draws from the minds of the sitters is, on the face of it, more plausible. Andrija particularly is a knowledgeable and widely read man. There are problems with this explanation, however. For one thing, the range and quality of the content of the communications does not vary with the identity of the sitters. Andrija was not present, for instance, when Tom elaborated his statement about the beginnings of civilization on Earth. And in the period subsequent to the one covered by the present narrative, there have been many sessions in which she has not participated, and some from which John has been absent. But the content of these communications is totally consistent with the rest. Telepathy is said to work regardless of distance, so it may be argued that Phyllis is still drawing on Andrija's unconscious even when he is not present. But the parapsychological studies that have demonstrated telepathy at a distance have also shown that information thus obtained tends to be fragmentary, discontinuous, and magistic rather than conceptual. There's no evidence that coherent and sustained thought can be conveyed or picked up telepathically. The same applies to the hypothesis of selective clairvoyance. As much of the information is elicited by questioning and not simply given, and as it builds up into a consistent pattern, piece by piece, over a period of time, in order to support the clairvoyance hypothesis, we would have to assume the working of a consistent principle of selectivity, and that a multiplicity of channels to different kinds of information would be simultaneously open. This is what Professor Hornell Hart, discussing the survival question, called the super ESP hypothesis. The acquisition of virtually any information can be attributed to super ESP. And if the communications consisted only of information, the hypothesis might apply. But, as we have seen, they consist of much more. And the teaching, the exhortation, the pertinent psychoanalysis, the spontaneous wisdom, the personal criticism, and the vigorous dialectic are all factors that argue against the super-ESP hypothesis. So again, logical consideration weigh in favor of possibilities 4 and 5. And as for the Akashic Records explanation, the idea that there exists a cosmic reservoir of information and memories that can be tapped by a gifted psychic, there would seem to be little to choose from the point of view of plausibility between this and the non-human intelligence hypothesis. It is perhaps relevant to note that the Edgar Cayce material, which has some characteristics in common with the Ossining communications, was said to have been derived from a kind of cosmic reservoir of knowledge, and that in later communications Tom has said that such, in fact, exists. The method of argument by elimination, which I have followed in the foregoing pages, can only, of course, favor one of several predetermined conclusions. And so it is always open to the criticism that there may be other hypotheses that have not been taken into account. I cannot think of any though, however, and I would submit the conclusion that the evidence we have surveyed is compatible with our hypothesis number 5, that Phyllis is channeling information that emanates from a non-human intelligence, whereas it is not compatible with the more obvious psychological and parapsychological explanations. But the term non-human intelligence could apply to either of our original hypotheses 4 and 5. This carnate spirit, or an intelligent being from another part of the cosmos. Can we now determine which of these alternatives the facts favor? I believe we can consider a few points that are germane to the question, though I am well aware that some readers with a philosophical turn of mind will consider that to attempt rationally to choose between two hypotheses when there is no empirical basis for belief in either of them is an absurd enterprise. For the sake of the argument, we have to assume that both spirits and extraterrestrials might exist. The reader might recall the conclusion reached by the Columbia professor of logic and ethics, James Hislop, that in a number of cases, persons whose condition would ordinarily be described as due to some form of mental disturbance showed unmistakable indications of invasion by foreign or discarnate agency. The formulation foreign or discarnate entities corresponds with our hypothesis 4 and 5. So, assuming that they both exist, how would you distinguish a spirit from an extraterrestrial? Well, for a start, the content of the respective communications might be a pointer. There is quite a substantial literature of alleged spirit communications, but they tend to fall into William James' philosophy and water category. As that most critical of early psychical researchers, Frank Podmore, wrote of the Reverend Stainton Moses' spirit teachings, it needed not that a spirit should descend from the seventh sphere to preach views which could be heard from any Unitarian pulpit. Such teachings, which are usually obtained through automatic writing, generally consist of pious sentiments, exhortations to a more noble way of life, and descriptions of the next world, all couched in a pedestrian and woolly language, which makes the sarcasm of the term inspirational writings, which is often applied to them. Podmore's remark about spirit teachings implies, particularly for the modern reader, that Stainton Moses' automatic writing was channeling nothing more than contents of his own unconscious. But it is not a justified conclusion of the evidence of the content alone. If spirits are, as both some of their own alleged testimonies and esoteric traditions maintain, the surviving non-physical part of the former human beings, reluctant to leave the earth and its physical attractions, we should not expect them to be wiser or more knowledgeable than human beings. The only thing they would know more about would be the mode and condition of post-mortal existence. The content of spirit literature tends to bear this out. Right, I think I'm going to make a break here, because he is picking it apart quite detailed. Today's Wednesday, the 26th of March, and I wish you a good day.